These are African rhythms, passed down to us through ancient spirits. Feel the spirit, a unifying force. Come on, move with the spirit. Stand up, clap your hands. Groove with the rhythms, get down.
From WSNC 90.5 FM, a broadcasting service and NPR affiliate of Winston-Salem State University, welcome to Africa World Now Project. I'm your host and producer, James Poe. Today, HBCUs, Crisis and Future Trajectories, moving beyond struggle. Africa World Now Project is next. Today, we bring you a recent wide-ranging conversation exploring the HBCU as a response to and product of coloniality, sovereignty of the Black imagination, the philosophical roots of Black thought, Black study, and the impetus of evolving Black institutions back to becoming a maroon space with Dr. Coy Walker and Dr. Josh Myers. Dr. Coy Walker is currently a visiting professor at the University of Richmond, where he teaches courses in leadership studies and the humanities at the Jepson School of Leadership Studies at the School of Arts and Sciences. He collaborates with campus and community partners on research, teaching, and public programming on the university's recently acquired Wyatt Tee Walker collection. He is also Senior Fellow in Religious Freedom at the Religious Freedom Center of the Freedom Forum Institute in Washington, D.C. An accomplished academic leader, Dr. Walker served as Vice President and Dean of the Samuel DeWitt Proctor School of Theology at Virginia Union University prior to coming to the University of Richmond. Other leadership roles include serving as founding dean of the College of Arts, Science, Business, and Education at Winston-Salem State University, chair of the Department of Africana Studies at Brown University, and the inaugural director of the Center for the Study of Local Knowledge at the University of Virginia. As a teacher-scholar, Dr. Walker has served as a member of the faculty at the University of Virginia, Brown University, Winston-Salem State University, and Virginia Union University. He was also visiting professor at the Historical Institute of the Friedrich Schiller University in Jena, Germany, and a non-resident fellow at the W.E.B. Du Bois Institute for African and African American Research at Harvard University. Dr. Walker is author of the book A Noble Fight, African American Freemasonry and the Struggle for Democracy in America, editor of the special issue of the journal Political Theology on the theme Theology and Democratic Futures, and associate editor of the award-winning Sage Encyclopedia of Identity. He has published over 50 articles, reviews, book chapters, and essays, appearing in a wide range of scholarly journals. He co-directed and co-produced the documentary film Fifeville with acclaimed artist and filmmaker Kevin Jerome Everson. Walker's scholarship focuses on the complexities of religion, philosophy, history, memory, culture, and public life. In addition to being a valued member of the Africa Now Collective and its affiliates, Dr. Josh Myers is currently an assistant professor of Africana Studies at the Department of Afro-American Studies at Howard University. In addition to serving on the board of the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilizations and the editorial board of the Compass, Journal of the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilizations, he works with DC area collectives, Positive Black Folks in Action, and the New African Cultural Vanguard. His research interests include Africana intellectual histories and traditions, Africana philosophy, critical university studies, and disciplinarity. His work has been published in the Journal of African American Studies, the Journal of Pan-African Studies, the African Journal of Rhetoric, the Human Rights and Globalization Law Review, Liberator Magazine, Decolonization, Indigeneity, Knowledge and Society, Critical Ethnic Studies, and Pamazuka, among other literary spaces. His book, We Are Worth Fighting For, The Howard University Protest of 1989, is forthcoming. Our show is produced today in solidarity with the Native, Indigenous, African, and Afro-descendant communities at Standing Rock, Venezuela, Corporation Jackson in Jackson, Mississippi, Brazil, the Avalon Village in Detroit, Colombia, Kenya, Palestine, South Africa, and Ghana, and other places who are fighting for the protection of our land for the benefit of all peoples. Enjoy the program. Thank you guys for joining the show today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
This discussion that we wanted to pull together today, actually want to look at HBCUs in the context of now and also in the future, because there are a lot of things that is in the news around Bennett College and other universities. But this discussion that I thought that we should have is to really contextualize the discourse around HBCUs currently, but also towards the future. And here I'm thinking of Du Bois, Whither, Now, and Why. And what I'll do is we can start with Josh. within the context of how do we understand HBCUs now and towards the future in the context of Du Bois's Whither, Now, and Why?
Thanks for having me again. It's really, to me, a question of what are we going to do with the question of knowledge, right? And so many of the conversations around HBCUs are rightly held about resources, how to survive and how to navigate, neoliberal late capitalism, and what are we going to do about enrollment? These sort of metrics. But I think also what Du Bois calls us to consider is this question of knowledge. What is the fundamental intellectual foundation, the basis of what we do at these particular institutions? And to me, those two conversations don't have to be negations of each other. I think we can do both. In fact, I think if we start from intellectual basis, I think it'll help us deal with this question of resources. And I think so. Du Bois, of course, argues in Whither, Now, and Why that we have to use our own history and culture to kind of inform, the future in the wake of this coming integration that he saw on the horizon in 1960 when he gave that speech. I think, so many years on from that, HBCUs have to reconsider what it is to be grounded in our own history and culture in order to produce knowledge, but also to produce a change, a shift in how, the world is ordered and how it's, rationalized. I think ultimately, if you look at the function of the Western University, it has been, to rationalize the existing sort of order of things. I think Black people obviously can't continue to participate in that. I think HBCUs are the institutions who could lead a shift, in reordering how we think about, what the world can be and what the world should be in the future.
And in the context of that particular response, Dr. Corey Walker, here we have the idea of knowledge production as a response to an existing world order of things, right? I'm thinking now of the vocation of the Black scholar. I'm thinking now of the long trajectory of Africana Studies as being a center of knowledge, not only within the context of HBCUs, but in how we understand the world. How should we understand, this question of knowledge and also questioning the existing order of things in the world by using Harding's vocation of the Black scholar?
Well, first of all, I want to thank you, James, for convening this vitally important conversation. As Josh mentioned, today we're witnessing a public conversation on HBCUs that all but evades the core issues that these institutions came into being for, and that is for a particular knowledge production connected to the advancement of the people and an advancement of a more humane society. In many ways, Du Bois's 1960 statement not only touches on knowledge production, it also touches upon a particular ethics, an ethics that guides the critical investigations that are undertaken in these intellectual spaces. When we think of HBCUs, all too often we hear a preoccupation with certain pragmatic considerations, enrollment, as Josh mentioned, or questions around accreditation. But I think if you wrap these issues if you think these issues in and through the very idea of what these institutions are about, and that is about producing certain types of individuals, producing a certain type of human, and producing certain types of citizens that act in an ethical way in the world, then you begin to touch on why you have to then organize these universities in a way to produce those types of citizens. How you then must resource these institutions in a particular way to develop these types of citizens, and how you arrange these institutions, not in the way of just any university, but of a particular university whose mission is designed to create critical ethical subjects in the world. So when we move from Du Bois to Vincent Harding, Harding takes that issue up at the forefront. Harding forces us to look at the question of the relationship between the scholar and the academic community, the scholar and universities, the scholar and other Black institutions. The idea of the scholar who occupies this space and who's been formed in a certain understanding and in a certain world and in a certain context, is not looking toward a university to act as mere the same or to copy other universities. It's amazing how many universities adopt a similar language of innovation, a language around design, a language around responding to students as customers or as consumers, instead of thinking about universities as critical institutions that are producing certain types of citizens to create a much more humane existence and a much more humane world. These are the core issues that Harding confronts in that 1974 text, The Vocation of the Black Scholar and the Struggles of the Black Community. And Harding adopts the language of vocation, which is critical. The language of vocation means that we're moving beyond just the mere utilitarian conception of education to a much more passionate, much more holistic, much more humanistic embrace of knowledge connected to the broader interests of humanity, to the broader interests of society. When we think of that conception, then we have to attain a level, we have to attain an institutional form that enables students and enables scholars to continue to push toward that mission. When we do that, then we realize that the university, as its in its Humboldtian ideal in the West, may not be the proper or may not be the fullest expression of these ethical values, of these epistemic concerns. Indeed, it may mean that we opt for new types of university spaces. It may mean that we begin to look at the transformation of the university, something that has been that has undergone that the transformation that has undergone since the second half of the 20th century, and is really receiving impetus through a number of international movements, particularly the decolonization of the university movement on the continent. When you look at what's going on in universities throughout the subcontinent in India, when you look at universities and the way in which they're responding to particular political and economic pressures throughout the Americas, what we're seeing is a radical transformation and shift from the university as just this one site of a sort of rudimentary, or a better term would be this perfunctory university knowledge production, to the university that is aligned with the majority of the interests of citizens throughout a particular nation state and throughout the world. I think when we begin to cast the question of Black colleges within that mold in our contemporary moment, we'll achieve a much more critical discourse, not only about the future of historically Black colleges, but also about the faculty that'll occupy these particular spaces, the students that'll come into these spaces looking to change the world, the ways in which knowledge is organized in these institutional spaces beyond just those dominant disciplinary boundaries. And we'll look at a renewed space where the university is aligned with and in service to the broader community that often surrounds Black universities, which are Black communities both in the U.S. and also globally. So I think it opens up an opportunity for us to begin to rethink and recast HBCUs in the mold of a Du Bois, in the mold of a Vincent Harding, and yes, in the mold of an Anna Julia Cooper, who reminds us of a particular sterile knowledge that can't be the fate of humanity, but must be a robust knowledge that will embrace all of humanity.
And Dr. Myers, piggybacking off of the terms of engagement that Dr. Walker just kind of laid out here, and to encapsulate all of that, is that what we're looking for is a new philosophy of education, a new, or I shouldn't say new, Josh. I mean, because, and the reason why I say this is because if we understand the origins of HBCU and its connection to the global African world, I think that what we're doing is there's a reclamation, or really a reclamation process that needs to happen.
I absolutely agree. We remember that Du Bois comes back from Liberia in the 1920s. He begins to write about this African ethic in education. It's really about, fundamentally about how to be human in the world. And, they had, access to generations of knowledge of what that looked like. And we have access to generations, of knowledge workers that can tell us what that looks like. He comes to Fisk University in 1933, and that's how he starts his famous speech, The Field and Function of the Negro College. And so it absolutely has to be grounded in these older models that we have. I've thought about the Per Unc, the House of Life, and how that concept of education going back to the Kemetic traditions, can feed our present, can help us think about the present. Following through to, the traditions that we find in Timbuktu, the assumptions that guides, how to deal with education in those particular contexts. And so we have the models. And I think the question that Du Bois raised, in the 1930s is, if we're going to be grounded in our own cultural traditions, that's going to transform, the kind of structure that we find ourselves in these institutions. And he says, that's what all other universities have done. All other national universities have done. The French universities founded on French culture. The Spanish university was founded on Spanish culture. And he says, what are the Negro universities? It's like, I think that's a continuing injunction for us. And so the other thing that we can stand on is that, we aren't the first people to think about this, even in the last centuries, right? The latter half of the 20th century, this conversation was prominent at HBCUs. It was prominent at HWCUs and Black Studies departments. It's very important, as we've done shows on this before with you, to talk about the Black university model that comes out of, the struggles in Black power. Howard University students wanting to change the name of Howard to Sterling Brown University, which meant more than just a cosmetic change to name it after a Black person. It was also they chose Sterling Brown strategically because of what Sterling Brown represented in terms of his intellectual thrust, right? And so the Black university model, but also the attempt to create, Black separate colleges. We always talk about Black studies as the creation of programs, departments, but there were so many others who wanted separate colleges, like the model that we have at Cornell, right? That was one of the most predominant forms of struggle in that particular period. And the reason they wanted separate colleges is because they didn't want to use the space, intellectual space, but also the administrative space, that was grounded in these Western philosophical assumptions about what it meant to do knowledge, what it meant to comprehend reality. And so they knew that they needed separate space because it was a separate discourse that could then reinforce what it means to be human on a more universal level. Du Bois says you can't start from sociology and get to Negro sociology. You can't start from, history and get to Negro history. That's not the way things actually operate. You start from your own particular cultural assumptions, and then you get to the universal. And so that's what we've been struggling for, ever since. And I think what we've experienced, I think in the last 20, maybe 15, maybe last 15 years, is a decline in that particular conversation, not only at HBCUs, but also Black Studies has become at HWCUs this sort of cover for diversity, institutional diversity, as opposed to institutional transformation.
And I wanted to stay within the context of this idea that Dr. Walker kind of laid out about decolonizing the university. And Josh, as you kind of situated the idea of the HBCU or the Black or an Africana or a Black Studies education is international, right? So there's this idea, and Dr. Walker, you served in dual roles at HBCU because, of course, you were an administrator at HBCUs, two HBCUs, just as recently as in the past 2 years. And so there are real constraints that faculty face, but also institutionally that HBCUs face. There are obviously real constraints, and there's some core issues that must be addressed. But if we're really talking about the sustainability of HBCUs moving towards Black universities, there's a fundamental restructuring of education, of the decolonization of the university that must take place. How does that component, having the experience that you have, what are some of the barriers and also opportunities that must be highlighted in this particular conversation?
Well, I think when you take this conversation and you move it as the dominant conversation, you will move away from these sorts of hagiographic conversations about what HBCUs have done and sort of a narrative of ascent from slavery to freedom in a manner mapped over to historically Black colleges, to how do you begin to develop and continually evolve an institution that responds to the pressing needs of Africans in the U.S. and throughout the world. Pragmatically, what that opens up is a chance to begin to re-narrate HBCUs around a black university context. What that means is everyone is looking for special and unique spaces to produce new knowledge. If we are to produce new knowledge, what better basis to produce that knowledge than from those intellectual traditions that are thousands of years old? I'm reminded of Usman Kane's recent book, Beyond Timbuktu, where Usman Kane looks at the traditions of West African Islam beyond Timbuktu to look at the ways in which Africans were writing African languages utilizing Arabic script. Of course, what that reminds us of is the very vernacularization of language, the ways in which ideas and symbols interrelate, and also opens up new imaginaries for new possibilities for the organization of knowledge. When we look in our contemporary moment, when we take a critical analysis of our historically Black colleges, too often what we find are curricular programs that mirror some of the more staid and traditional formulas of universities prior to 1950. We have institutions teaching Western civilization. We have institutions who are teaching basic English in terms of a rote system of English language and English literature that mirrors a K through 12 program. Instead of moving students beyond what they've done for 13 years in their K through 12 experience, to begin to embrace true higher education. Now, that can map onto, in a pragmatic sense, that can map onto the very discourse of innovation, that can map onto discourses of creativity, that maps onto discourses of collaboration, because you're looking at organizing a university context and organizing a university learning community around new problems, new ideas, and new ways of learning, where you're sharing knowledge production and reproduction between faculty and students, where you're inviting community members to join the intellectual conversation to produce new knowledge, where the university is responding to contemporary crises that are afflicting communities surrounding universities. None of those crises and none of those issues are the sole province of any disciplinary formation in the university. Instead, they rely on a new knowledge that's produced in the nexus of individuals coming from differing disciplinary formations, bringing their different approaches, methodologies, categories to bear on key questions affecting humanity. And out of that grows new knowledge that then serves as a basis to advance knowledge and human understanding. That means that Black colleges at this particular moment serve as a vanguard, if you will, for the ways in which universities can proceed throughout the U.S. If we begin to catalyze this conversation as the dominant conversation around Black colleges, not in a conversation around salvation for salvation's sake, but a conversation of we need these institutions to be as innovative as they were in the past, because Black colleges create new spaces for knowledge production and reproduction and advance the human condition. We have to remember that it was in and through Black colleges that the very idea of the university being in service to the community was legitimated and promoted as the very core mission of the institution. It was not an isolated ideal or a space shut off from the world, as we saw with even the construction of spaces such as Oxford and Cambridge, or even when we look at Cornell as a university on a hill away from communities. Black colleges were created in communities. And that was an innovation the innovation that is now commonplace in higher education. Black colleges can serve as the space for innovating new knowledge, but only only if we place knowledge at the core and at the center of our conversations, only if we look at knowledge production as our core mission, and how do we then engage in institutional formation and intellectual transformation that then enables us to achieve that mission. If we continue to stay stuck on Black colleges in a discourse that focuses in a very hierarchical fashion on leaders, that then fixate on individuals and not communities, that fixate on performance instead of how we begin to develop critical scholars and scholarship in and through a communal organization of knowledge production, then we'll find ourselves repeating the same conversation. But what I think Josh did in his genealogy from the 1920s to our contemporary moment is highlight the subterranean stream of thought that, if thematized, if it becomes the dominant conversation, has the ability to then transform how we think about HBCUs and how HBCUs operate in the 21st century.
And I cannot help but think, Josh, and there's two streams of thought process here that I kind of want us to kind of unpack here. First one is the creation of a maroon space. And the second one is the disciplinary heretical thinking that must be couched within the production of Black thought. And I'm thinking about Black think, Black study. We know Fred Moten, and Stefan Harney is thinking about this idea of how to use this space. And here, this framework of Black think, Black study, or thinking Black out loud, I can't help but think that there's two strands of thought that Corey kind of laid out here. How do we create or recreate a maroon space, but also the heretical aspect of kind of moving beyond these ideas of disciplines? Those provide threats to the status quo of the university and knowledge production as we understand it today. Yeah,
I think both of those streams, I think, requires us to take up a number of challenges. You have to take up the challenge, that Sylvia Wynter launched, over the last, 50 years in terms of her attempt to undo man, or to kind of think through what she calls the coloniality of being truth, power, and freedom. That letter to her colleagues was not just, addressed, to this overweening influence of whiteness and white scholars. It was also addressed, to the disciplinary structures that underpin whiteness, and to the extent that Black scholars, continue to reproduce those same disciplinary structures, there's not much of a difference. And so we have to take up that challenge. The challenge, you mentioned, Fred Moten's work, and you've had him, on the show. I think, that's a continuing concern. The undercommons, exist wherever we create it. It doesn't have to be a formal structure. In fact, there's a danger to making it a formal structure, I think. It could be our classrooms. It could be our office hours. It could be the kind of spaces we create, that are informal. Those things then, they filter out into the world and they transform the world. But we have to convene those spaces wherever we are and be purposeful about that. There's a challenge of Cheikh Anta Diop in terms of this question of disciplinarity, and how might we reorder, how we organize knowledge based on, the thrust of his work. I think I was just talking to a colleague, brother, Lafayette Gaston, this past week, who's been doing a lot of work around Cheikh Anta Diop. And, his concern is that in the U.S., we read his work only through one lens, only through the historical lens. We kind of leave off all the other, components of his work to advance a very narrow portion of his larger thesis. But if you read Cheikh Anta Diop deeply beyond, this kind of narrow frame of, African origin of civilizations, he has a holistic approach to how to reconstruct knowledge and how to think differently, and is grounded in, these African traditions that, we've been talking about. And so I wonder how that would look once we say, what if we reorganize university based on, Diop's understanding, what he called pluridisciplinary teams of knowledge, right? And so there's also the challenge of Jacob Carruthers, I think. When we read his kind of assault against the idea of disciplinarity, he does it on two levels. He started where he was in terms of political science, but he ends up saying, ultimately this idea of the polis is not something that we can afford to recreate if we're going to recreate our liberation, right? Or if we're going to imagine our liberation. On the other level, he talks about what he calls metaphysics of alienation, and how ultimately, the whole premise of Western knowledge production and its relationship to the Enlightenment requires a sort of alienation from the idea of, the metaphysical realm. And that's something that African people have never actually accepted, even as we inhabit the academy, right? And we never separate those fears. In fact, those fears are an ecstatic community, and they create, fundamental transformations when they converge. And so it also reminds me, of course, of the work of Cedric Robinson, his understanding of the Black radical tradition, which, if you look at how scholars
We are currently listening to a recent wide-ranging conversation exploring the HBCU as a response to and a product of coloniality, sovereignty of the Black imagination, the philosophical roots of Black thought, Black study, and the impetus of evolving Black institutions back to becoming a maroon space with Dr. Corey Walker and Josh Myers. Dr. Corey Walker is currently a visiting professor at the University of Richmond, where he teaches courses in leadership studies and the humanities at the Jepson School of Leadership Studies and the School of Arts and Sciences. He collaborates with campus and community partners on research, teaching, and public programming on the university's recently acquired Wyatt Tee Walker collection. He is also Senior Fellow in Religious Freedom at the Religious Freedom Center of the Freedom Forum Institute in Washington, D.C. Dr. Walker is author of the book A Noble Fight, African American Freemasonry and the Struggle for Democracy in America, editor of the special issue of the journal Political Theology on the theme Theology and Democratic Futures, and associate editor of the award-winning Sage Encyclopedia of Identity. Dr. Walker is preparing his second book, Between Transcendence and History, an essay on religion and the future of democracy in America. In addition to being a valued member of the Africa Now Collective and its affiliates, Dr. Josh Myers is currently an assistant professor of Africana Studies in the Department of Afro-American Studies at Howard University. His research interests include Africana intellectual histories and traditions, Africana philosophy, critical university studies, and disciplinarity. His work has been published in the Journal of African American Studies, the Journal of Pan-African Studies, the African Journal of Rhetoric, the Human Rights and Globalization Law Review, Liberator Magazine, Decolonization, Indigeneity, Knowledge and Society, Critical Ethnic Studies, and Pamazuka, among other literary spaces. His book, We Are Worth Fighting For, The Howard University Protest of 1989, is forthcoming. Our show is produced today in solidarity with the Native, Indigenous, African, and Afro-descendant communities at Standing Rock, Venezuela, Corporation Jackson in Jackson, Mississippi, Brazil, the Avalon Village in Detroit, Colombia, Kenya, Palestine, South Africa, and Ghana, and other places who are fighting for the protection of our land for the benefit of all peoples. Continue to enjoy the program.
The Black radical tradition, which, if you look at how scholars are thinking about it, talked about this with Jared Ball about a year and a half ago. When you look at how scholars are thinking about that, they completely excised metaphysical assumptions that guide how Black people saw the material world, right? Those things aren't, separate spheres. We don't have a mind-body problem, right? So Robinson, of course, begins to help us reorient ourselves around how to think with our ancestors through the reality that they face, to be able to see that there is a sort of otherwise beyond the idea of oppression and the idea that resistance must look a certain way if it's going to be real, right? And so resistance intellectually, resistance in terms of how we inhabit university. Greg Carr, our common comrade, talks about how Black studies, Africana studies, is an extension of the Black radical tradition into the academy. And so to occupy that sort of genealogy, I think, becomes the challenge. And we all do that wherever we are. But I think ultimately, the bigger question or the bigger concern that I have is, how do we reproduce that particular thrust on an institutional level? And if we can do that, how do we spread that and, kind of perpetuate that? Do we even need new institutions in order to do that? That's something I think about all the time. So I just want to throw that out there, but I think we have multiple challenges, and I think these individual thinkers help us work through them. I think ultimately we can build sort of workshops or so we can build communities around the challenges associated with those particular thinkers and how to kind of, forward our work through those particular models.
And you're making some very important points, Josh, because this leads right directly to, Corey, I'm thinking about the work that you have done in your scholarship and also really taking these ideas, the work, the ideas of justice and the new humanity and moving it into a more practical understanding. How do you take this scholarship and this study and move it into actual building institutions? And I know your work has attempted to do that. And so in response to what Josh is saying, Corey, because it's leading directly into, a number of questions that you ask about humanity, these human questions, this planetary existence, and then centering the discussions, the long genealogy of discussions that are happening in the African world around climate change, around spirituality, around history, and really providing a base for those who come to an HBCU or a Black university and move these questions beyond, as Josh had said, kind of like there's a reality beyond struggle of that folk are constantly thinking about. And I kind of wanted you to respond to what Josh said just now, but also within the context of really the sovereignty of the imagination here.
I think when you go through that deep, complex genealogy, those ideas, those imaginaries that are opened up, provide an opportunity to then give expression to an institutional organization that then responds to the greatest aspirations that bind us together as humans. I know for the past 5 years, both at Winston-Salem State University and at the Samuel DeWitt Proctor School of Theology at Virginia Union University, that was my guiding aim and goal. It was to begin to meld a core set of ideas, a core set of intellectual provocations around creating a much more humane existence and trying to give institutional expression to that. In many ways, what you see is that at HBCUs, we have an opportunity to reorganize those institutional spaces, whether it be creating new academic departments, new intellectual programs, even broad new intellectual structures. At Winston-Salem State, we just brought together everything under one idea of the college. What we also have an opportunity to do is to then look at how do we organize intellectual life quite differently. And here we do have some analogs and some experiments that are going on wholesale. I think of Michael Crow and what he's done over at Arizona State. Michael Crow has gotten rid of department, created schools around School of Historical Studies, School of Historical, Philosophical, and Social Studies. Created all of these new interesting configurations. I received a call from a former colleague of mine from Brown, and we're collaborating to bring a new program together here in Richmond within the next year, animated around overturning relationships of knowledge and power. We look at Hampshire College, and unfortunately, Hampshire right now is faced with some challenges and is not accepting any new students for the next year. But here's a college that was actually for over 50 years. Here's a university that organized itself around programs of studies created by students. When we look at the Black university, when we look at its institutional expression, say at Malcolm X Liberation University, we're finding those historical analogs that then open up new possibilities for HBCUs in our contemporary context. It's not, we don't have to take a TINA approach to Black colleges. That is, there is no alternative other than a neoliberal university. No, I firmly believe in Black genius. I firmly believe in Black creativity. Throughout my experiences at HBCUs, both as a professor and as an administrator, I have yet to find an audience that was not animated and captivated by a vision of Black flourishing, of Black creativity, and of Black genius, and also individuals who want to support that vision. I've yet to find individuals who are not interested in that. And in an age where we're seeing the exhaustion of certain intellectual models, where we're seeing the inability to scale certain classical models to a contemporary moment, then it begs Black colleges are basically being begged to develop their own genius that's latent within them, to move beyond a discourse of sort of starvation or a discourse of death to a discourse of plenitude. The plenitude is not just within fiscal resources. The plenitude for Black universities, the wealth and resources for Black universities are in Black intellect and in Black genius. When you then make that the focus and center of your existence, you're operating from the historic moment of the infinite possibilities of human creativity. You do that, then you're able to advance those knowledge formations. You're able to advance those ideas. You're able to develop new concepts of the sciences. You're able to develop new concepts of medicine and of health sciences and of technology that create a much more humane existence. We're able to then move to what Charles Long will call the humanities of other humans. We're looking at a humanities that moves beyond just the classic confrontation or classic conception, rather, of the humanities of a sort of a memorialized Greek and Roman civilization to a humanities of all individuals. We're also creating an opportunity to bring in more knowledges, more foundations of knowledges from throughout the world. These are ideas that find analogs in places like Clark Kerr's the multi-university. These are ideas that find themselves within the Black university discourse. These are ideas that are attempting to be thematized in Malcolm X Liberation University, which, by the way, has a wonderful film available by St. Clair Bourne at the National Museum for African American History and Culture that's available online. That film and Howard Fuller's statement about not wanting to be just another university or not relegating Black studies to a department in the university speaks to the infinite possibilities of HBCUs in our moment. But we have to have the courage, the determination, and the dedication to unleash Black genius in our particular moment. And that takes leadership. That takes not just the conception of leadership from a hierarchical standpoint. It is a conception of leadership that catalyzes the visions of faculty, staff, students, and communities in these new learning spaces.
Josh, did you want to respond before we kind of filter this conversation through the current?
Everything that Corey said in terms of, it's a question of courage, because we do exist. All of that being true, we do exist also in conservative spaces, and it's going to take political will to kind of to imagine, the vision that I think we have to have in order to facilitate this process of transformation.
So now let's take this conversation and let's filter it. Everything that we kind of laid out here, the ideas, and also the conceptualization of decolonizing the university, the conceptualization of the sovereignty of the imagination. Let's filter this conversation in the current crisis of HBCUs. Now, I want to use this term loosely because this question of the state of HBCUs, the sustainability of HBCUs, is a question that has always been dealt with, and also dealt with successfully. How do we understand all of what we're saying is a product of the crisis of some of our HBCUs today?
James, I think to take this head on, what we have to do is we have to remind ourselves of a longer history of these institutions. Most of the Black institutions created post-1865 no longer exist. There were a plethora of Black universities, Black colleges that no longer exist because of the transformations in larger political economy, because of transformations in Black college, in the ecology of Black colleges, as well as because of transformations in a larger economy of how we begin to think about knowledge production and reproduction and knowledge legitimation. I mean, we just look at the history of Black medical schools. And when you think about the history of Black medical schools, we find that as soon as you create the accreditation formulas and schemes for medical schools, Black medical schools cease to exist. And we only have two right now, one in California and Meharry in Tennessee. And we had medical schools. One was at Shaw University. I mean, not California, of course, Howard and Meharry. When you think about medical schools at Shaw University, when you think of medical schools throughout the South, it was really when you think of that the turn of the 19th, early 20th century, when you when there was a desire to have quote unquote more professionalized medicine, that then you saw the erasure or the eclipse of Black colleges. When you had the accreditation processes that really ramped up in the mid 20th century to after World War II, you've had the eclipse of a number of historically Black colleges that just could not receive accreditation, particularly from the Southern Association, that historically had not accredited Black colleges, but then became the arbiter of Black college accreditation and became the arbiter of financial support. So we've gone through this wave after wave in which Black institutions were placed, some did die, others continued to thrive, others continued to survive. In this new moment, when we think of historically Black colleges, I'm reminded that in 1972, only 30% of Black students were being educated in Black colleges. That was 4 years. That was 8 years after the federal legislation designating historically Black colleges as those institutions prior to 1964 having a primary mission of educating African Americans. Within 8 years, you see that the majority of Black students were being educated in other spaces, and that number now is decreased to less than 10%. So what we're seeing is a continuation of a trajectory, and what we have to do is look at how do we continue to strengthen those institutions that are providing quality and critical education for our students. How do we then develop new modes of new programs, new organizational forms, and new communities to educate a generation that is non-responsive to the higher educational forms that we have in existence now? And then how do we recapture the creative genius, creative Black genius within these institutional forms? We've all know that the private church-affiliated Black colleges are some of the most precarious Black institutions in existence, and we've known that since the 1960s. We've had study after study from the 1960s up through the 1980s around a certain sector of our Black colleges. As we see state-level funding continue to decrease, then we have to look at how do we continue to have Black publicly funded institutions in light of decreases in state funding. And also, we have to look at the debt burden that our students carry. Students cannot graduate from Black colleges coming from under-resourced communities, coming from communities where the access to capital is very limited, and then graduating from college tens of thousands of dollars in debt, and then having to go out into the job market just to take any job, not a job that fulfills their passions or not a job that they're enabled to transform the world, but to just get a job in order to pay student loans that then become a burden for them to live otherwise. I think when we take that longer arc, we're then understanding that the crisis of Black colleges is one that's always already present. It's one that has a deep, long genealogy. It is one where we have multiple issues and multiple pressure points. We have to then disaggregate the HBCU sector to not treat every HBCU the same. Shaw University is not the same as Howard University. Howard is not the same as North Carolina A&T. It doesn't have the same mission. They don't have the same vision of themselves as an institution. And we have to then begin to think through that this crisis is not something that's just of this moment. And it's not something that one fundraising campaign for the past, 3 or 4 months will solve. It is something that is deep. It is systemic. It requires an institutional response, but more importantly, it requires bold vision of all of our actors within the HBCU world. And then it requires us to then focus on what we do best. That is cultivate Black genius and all of its myriad expression.
Josh, what I'm hearing in this particular response is, of course, this genealogy, and again, these questions of Black thought and Black study is innately a resistance to the racialized order, the racialized capitalist order that we're living in. So, if I may, Corey is basically laying out and kind of like addressing this question that you kind of threw out earlier, and I don't want us to gloss over it because you said you threw it out there just to think about it. Like, do we need new institutions? I mean, so this is a very important question. Do we need new institutions? How do we support the institutions? But also, there is a genealogy here, and I don't want folks and our listeners to not think or to think about that we're looking just through the lens of crisis. We're looking through the lens of opportunity and imagination and creating new ways of understanding the world. And so what I'm hearing here is almost like a resurgence of cooperatives or communal formations that have a philosophical and also practical purpose in the cultural fabric of indigenous and ancient and African societies.
It makes me think and wonder about what kind of formations do we need in order to disrupt the normal functioning of neoliberalism and late capitalism. I think we have a genealogy of resistance to every other form. And I'm wondering what that form is going to take now, because ultimately that's what the crisis is. It's a crisis of the declining notion of a commons, the declining notion of a central state as somehow sort of security blanket for our educational institutions. And those things inevitably shaped the ways in which our private institutions had to survive. And so what do we do to disrupt that? Because if one sees the goal as the withering of the commons and the notion of a small government and how that kind of feeds, these attitudes, especially I'm from the South. And so I know, there are a lot of people who want to see institutions like South Carolina State University cease to exist fundamentally. And so for them, it's like, why does that institution exist? If it's going to exist, it needs to be University of South Carolina, Orangeburg, right? And so what do you do in the face of that sort of wider political environment and that sort of political and economic system that is so, as Corey said, systemic, and it's so ingrained in everything that we can imagine? And so with this whole Bennett thing, the only thing that we could imagine was, philanthropy as a solution. And we know that philanthropy, can't be the thing it can't be the permanent sort of solution to our issues. And so my question is, what does the formation that looks like a disruption to neoliberalism look like?
And Corey, being tied, HBCUs being tied to a crumbling notion of a nation state, obviously is very, very important here. And we know that folk who were involved in, questions around the Black university was literally dealing with this particular question of creating a self-sustaining institution that is perpetual, that moves self-sustaining. It's perpetual. I mean, I'm gonna repeat myself just now, but I mean, so HBCUs being tied to this crumbling notion of this settler colonial, this nation state is actually what I'm hearing Josh raise right now.
I think Josh raises a very significant question, because when you look at the support for historically Black colleges and universities, particularly public historically Black colleges and universities, it's tethered to a decline in the ways in which our the larger polity views democracy. In many ways, we are facing a legitimation crisis. Democracy as a governing form is facing its most serious and sustained crisis in our contemporary moment. That spills over into the ways in which individuals understand their role and functions as citizens. When you have movements of saying, my tax dollars are only for me, then what you're doing is you're shrinking the very idea of the commons, you're shrinking the very idea of the polity, and you're creating a very privatized notion of citizenship and a very private notion of democracy. That is antithetical to a project that HBCUs have contributed to in broadening and deepening democracy and expanding the boundaries of citizenship, and to looking toward a world where questions of national boundaries are not to keep individuals out, but as ways in which we open up to a broader world. How do we mobilize our communities in a moment of democratic crisis, in a moment where we think that a new Victorianism is the only way to go? A moment much like the 19th century where we have to ally ourselves with an Andrew Carnegie, or we have folks saying in common parlance, how do we then move to get a Mark Zuckerberg or or Michael Bloomberg to give multiple hundreds of millions of dollars to a black college? That conversation is so intellectually bankrupt that it really feeds on a notion that the only way universities exist, or the only way the only reason for these universities to exist, is to amass huge endowment. That's not the function of the university. The university's function is to begin to create opportunity, to begin to produce knowledge that advance the collective human condition. Much of the innovation that is the basis for this new Victorian capitalism came out of public university spaces and was funded by the taxpayers of the United States, many of them African American, who no longer are able to access or get a return on their tax dollars. What we have to do is to reassert a notion of the university that is a university that serves the public, that creates a knowledge, and develops learning communities that are responsive to human needs, that advances the horizon of human knowledge, and then enables us to mobilize our communities beyond crisis, to mobilize in our communities to enhance human creativity and human belonging. That's a political call. That's a call for how do you begin to develop a broad-based solidarity movement around these institutional spaces that are connected with other social movements that are afloat in our contemporary moment. Universities are not isolated from these movements, nor are they insulated from them because of their function. They're part and parcel of the democratic project that we seek to advance and seek to deepen. What does it look like? I wish I knew. In many ways, it's like the brothers and sisters organizing around Malcolm X Liberation University. They took an idea from SNCC and applied it to the university. If the university ceased to be responsive to the needs of the community, then the institutional form may cease to exist. But the mission continues to go on. And it is that mission that should organize our conversations, that should animate our public deliberations, and should fuel the best of our intellectual traditions and the best of our intellectual work at our Black colleges.
And as we conclude, I wanted to give Josh a chance to respond or to give some concluding thoughts, because what Corey is actually laying out here is actually the purpose, as you guys know, building this platform that we're talking on right now, is to present ideas and thought that feed practice. Because what I think is important is making sure that we have these discussions and center them in public discourse and put them out in a way and put enough out there in each of our particular conversations and in discourse that folk can pull something from and create what it is that we seek, what it is that that needs to be born. So Josh, I wanted to give you a chance to respond to Corey or to give some concluding thoughts.
Yeah, I think resistance to the logic, the premise of neoliberalism as it manifests in the university, I think requires us to kind of undo the idea that we're ultimately about the reproduction of an elite. This is the challenge that I always launch to my students at Howard. It's the challenge that I repeat to my friends who are alum and continue to support the university, is that it's more than just this kind of tepid idea of Black excellence that we should be about. A Black excellence that sees Black faces as power, right? Or Black faces in certain spaces and white spaces as power, right? A Black excellence that doesn't think about political economy, a Black excellence that doesn't think about, Black life even beyond the United States, a Black excellence that sort of reframes the thrust of Black genius and kind of, remands it to a corner that's not about the transformation that we're talking about. So part of the thrust, I think, is to kind of think differently than the sort of elite reproduction, and then sort of kind of imagine, what it would be to create a university that made sense to, our ancestors in the 1850s, our ancestors in the 15th century, right? How do we see ourselves as continuing their struggle to be and imagine and create a world that would reproduce who they are in the world, to think through what we do through their own human questions, right? I think if we start there, I think ultimately we can get to a place where we can imagine what this new transformation or this new model would look like, because I think it's urgent, because we're in peril right now. It's the same crisis that we've been dealing with the crisis of modernity, but I think now, I don't know if you all feel this, but I think there's less people thinking about it in a systematic way in the places that we inhabit, the places where we can think about it, right? Everybody is not in the positions to think about it in the way that we are, but it seems that there are less people thinking about it in a systematic way. So that's the challenge that I think, people who are listening to this particular program should take up in their respective places.
Corey, did you want to provide us, ours, and the listeners some concluding thoughts? But of course, this is an ongoing conversation, as we've done a number of variations of this conversation. But this conversation obviously is important, just as important now as it was when we did them before. Did you want to offer some concluding thoughts as we close?
I think Josh really sets the stage for us to continue this conversation and meet the challenge of our contemporary moment. In a moment where we're seeing the erasure of certain critical modes of thought, where we're witnessing a public discourse that lacks a critical historical consciousness, devoid of a genealogy of the institutional and individual practices of Black genius that may help us in our contemporary moment. In a moment where the public conversations around historically Black colleges and universities is around a truncated notion of crisis and not a broader generalized crisis of American civilization and of liberal democracy. In a moment where the current crisis of HBCUs are symptomatic of a current eclipse of imaginative possibilities, we have to muster the courage to begin to meet the challenge of a new generation in these institutional spaces, to give expression to new possibilities of hope, new possibilities of human belonging, and new possibilities of human community by reorganizing intellectual spaces that build off the best of our intellectual traditions and allow a collaborative spirit and ethos to pervade these spaces, such that then we're able to create new learning communities that advance the human condition. This is an audacious responsibility. Our historically Black colleges are one of the critical spaces that we have in Black America and indeed in the Africana world to enable us to elaborate these new possibilities. It is up to us, individuals at historically Black colleges and individuals who are aligned with the mission and vision of historically Black colleges, to continue that and to draw in a broader circle of like-minded scholars, students, and friends to advance the mission of these institutions so that we can advance the human condition. It's one that it's a task that's not for a single individual. It's a task that's not going to be done overnight. It's a task that's not going to be done in some heroic or individualist manner, but it is the long work of struggle for a beautiful world and struggle for a new humanity. And I think we're all committed to that. And we thank you, James. I want to thank you for continuing to convene these conversations to remind us of the beautiful struggle that we're all involved in, whether we're at a Black college or whether we're at a white college like myself, who are now continued and committed to a vision of Black genius and Black excellence that advances the human condition.
Josh Myers, thank you.
Absolutely, Ashe, thank you.
Corey Walker, thank you for taking the time.
Thank you, James.
That's it for Africa World Now Project for this week. I would like to thank you for joining us today and look forward to spending time with you next week. We can be reached through all your regular social media platforms. Email africaworldnowproject@gmail.com or follow us on Twitter at AFWRLDNWPRJ. I'm your host and producer, James Pope. The Africa World Now Project Collective consists of international media journalist, executive producer, and human rights activist Muizu Matali, Africa World Now Project media correspondent Funda Ngunda, senior research, content contributor, and production director Dr. Tasneem Siddiqui, senior researcher and content contributor and production associate Dr. Josh Myers, associate producer and content contributor Dr. Keisha Khan Perry, technology advisor is Byron Gray of Grayworks Technology, and creative director is Judah Pope. Africa World Now Project is heard every Wednesday at 7 p.m. on WSNC, NPR affiliate and broadcasting service of Winston-Salem State University. Shows are archived weekly on SoundCloud. Search Africa World Now Project. Until next week, be safe, be peaceful, and above all, be intelligent.